Today we're going to be talking about domain and range. So questions 27 through 32. Domain and range are very, very important words that we use in mathematics. I know they're new for us today. So domain and range. So identify the domain and identify the range. Let me show you guys a little chart that's going to help you guys know how to deal with this. So domain and range, I'm going to write them in alphabetical order. So let me write D for domain and then R for range. Notice I put them in alphabetical order. Now, they're going to be dealing with the X and the Y values. Domain and range deal with X and Y values. So on the right side of my table, let me write X and Y in alphabetical order. So X and Y. Let me write this equal signs in here. And to be honest, what we're going to be dealing with is domain are the possible X values. All right, the possible X values of the function. And my range are the possible Y values of my function. Okay, so let's take a look. My domain, right? I'm looking at my possible X value. I'm looking at this square root. Now, at this point, we only know how to get square roots of 0 or positive values, right? I can ask you what's the square root of 9? What's the square root of 4? We can even do decimals. What's the square root of 5? Right? We can figure out the square root of positive values. But if I ask you, what's the square root of -9? Right? What number multiplied by itself gives us -9? At this point, we cannot think about a possible solution, right? If we think 3, right? 3 times 3 is +9, not -9. If we think -3, -3 times -3 is +9, not -9. So at this point, we cannot do square root of negatives. Eventually we will, but not at this point. So I want to choose the possible values of X that don't give me a negative value inside of my square root. So I'm going to say my domain. Let me write domain. My X value cannot make this inside of the square root less than 0. So I can choose a -6, right? -6 plus 6 will give me a 0. I can choose -6 or anything higher than that. So I'm going to say X has to be greater or equal to -6. All right, because the -6, X equals -6, that will make the inside of my square root 0. If I choose anything higher than that, we'll make it a positive value. So it's fine. So I'm going to say my domain, X is greater or equal to -6. Now, how are we going to type this? Because of the symbol greater than or equal to. The way we're going to type this will be X greater than, then the equal sign, -6. So X is greater than or equal to -6. Your X should be lowercase. Now, for my range, what possible values of Y am I going to get? So let's see my range. I know this absolute value, I mean, the square root is going to be 0. That's the lowest it's going to get. I'm going to say my Y is going to be greater or equal to 0. Right? The square root is going to be 0 or higher. We're only dealing with the positive square roots. So let's take a look now at question number 28. Domain and range. So let me write that thing down. Domain is equal to my range. It's going to be equal to. Now, my X value, it's in here. The cube root of X. All right, cube root, we can have X being a positive value or a negative value. We can have any possible value of X. So when there's no restriction, I'm just going to write all real numbers. So that's going to be my domain. There's no restriction on x. I can choose any value. I can do the cube root of a positive. I can do the cube root of a negative. I can do the cube root of 0. I can do the cube root of any number. So we're going to call this all real numbers. And yeah, you do have to include the word real. Don't just say all numbers, because there are such thing as imaginary numbers. So yes, at this point, the numbers that we know are called real. They're real numbers. There are some numbers that we're going to learn later. We're going to call it imaginary. So yep, you do have to write the number real. I mean the word real. All real numbers. Now for my range. My x is going to be very, very low if it's a negative x. It's going to be very, very high if it's a positive x. And then plus 1. My plus 1, to be honest, in this case, does really not much, because there's no restriction on my x value. And I can get really low values or really high values. There's no restriction on my y value either. I'm going to call this all real numbers. Now, don't think that domain and range, if one of them is all real numbers, there's no restriction on that one. Don't think the other one is also all real numbers. So an example, I can give you guys that y is equal to the absolute value of x. My domain, I can choose any value of x that I want. That one I will say all real numbers. But my range in that case will be y is greater or equal to 0. Absolute value of x, the smallest result that I can get, absolute value of x will be 0. And anything higher than that. So don't think that because the domain is all real numbers, the range has to be all real numbers as well. It doesn't work like that. Let's take a look at question number 29. So let me write domain and range. My x is inside the square root. Okay, so the possible value of x I can think of is 0, and then any possible values. So x could be 0 or any positive value. So I'm going to say my domain x is greater or equal to 0, right? Because I'm dealing with the square root of x. X cannot be negative. Now for my range, let's take a look. My domain, the smallest value my domain can be is 0. So let me see that as a square root of 0. Now that's going to give me my smallest y value. So here I'm asking what's 4 times 0 minus 4. And that's going to give me my smallest y value. All right, 4 times 0 is 0. Minus 4 is a negative 4. So my range, I'm going to say y is greater or equal to negative 4. Let's take a look at question number 30. Domain and range. Let me write those things down. So domain and range. My x value is inside a square root. The square root of x plus 5. My square root cannot be negative, but x can be negative. So I'm thinking, okay, what will make my square root equal to 0 if x was equal to negative 5? So my domain is going to be x is greater or equal to negative 5. If x equals negative 5, it makes my square root 0. Square root can be positive or 0, but not negative. Square root. X is fine. X could be anything. So in this case, X is greater or equal to -5. Now let's take a look at Y. For me to find out my smallest Y value, I'm going to have 3/4 times 0. Because my square root, my smallest value for my square root is 0. So 3/4 times 0 is 0. So Y is greater or equal to 0. Last two examples. Let's take a look. Question number 31. Let me write domain. Remember, domain are the possible X values. And let me write range. Range are my possible Y values. Okay, so my X is inside this square root. So what value of X will make the square root 0? Well, if X equals 0, right? So X is greater or equal to 0. Now, for my Y values, for my range, I want to think of 2/3 times 0. I make my square root equal to 0. Because that's the smallest X the square root can be. And that's going to give me my smallest Y value. So 2/3 times 0. It's going to give me my smallest Y value. So anything times 0 is 0. So I'm just going to say Y is greater or equal to 0. Let's take a look at question number 32. I'm going to write domain and range. My X is inside the square root of X. So what's the smallest X value that I can think of? All right. So what's the smallest X value I can think of that will make my square root 0 or positive? Now in this case, I'm going to say X is greater or equal to 0, right? Because the square root of X, the smallest value of X can be 0. Now for my range, I'm going to look at 2 times 0. I make the square root 0. 2 times 0 minus 2. I know 2 times 0 is 0, and then 0 minus 2, say Y is greater or equal to -2.